Thank you, Anna. That was a wonderful talk. And I feel like it brings us deeper into your work, even for those who are quite familiar with your work, I think can gain a lot from hearing your own thoughts on your process and some background. It's really exciting. So far, we don't have any questions directly from the chat, but I've made quite a lot of my own. So we can start there, and then yeah, and then if anybody has questions, just please send them along, and we'll include them in the discussion. So I guess something that came up for me is that I feel like new technologies often trigger a kind of regression to older ideas in order to grasp the new. And I'm kind of wondering, do you feel as though sometimes your role as an artist is to develop new ways forward in thinking by breaking with tradition?
I think so. I think there are kind of like, that's a very astute observation. And I think kind of like the way that kind of machine learning art, I think one of the things that the way that kind of like it harks back to different traditions, I think, so to unpick it a little bit, I think there's kind of like a lot of the stuff that kind of came out in the very early GAN stuff that got very popular was very much kind of like it was kind of like very traditional kind of paintings, like the thing that sold at Christie's for $500,000, which was kind of like put through, it was trained on loads of kind of National Portrait Gallery type paintings, and it looked like, you know, like it was a white man with a background and kind of very traditional. And I think that's because a lot of the time people who are kind of working with this, they don't kind of, they're kind of like, it goes back to that question of like thinking that art means like a certain thing. And I think that kind of like is a mistake. But I think my role, I think like, but I think kind of like, and so that's kind of like an aside, but I think my role is kind of like to kind of see where this can go in more interesting ways. And I think that's the role of artists rather than kind of scientists, because it was kind of like, it was someone from kind of NVIDIA who first of all kind of made that kind of like the kind of like landscapey type GAN stuff. It was someone from Facebook who kind of made that paper that I referenced at the beginning. And it was even marketing students who made the picture that kind of sold for $500,000 at Christie's. These are not people who are kind of like versed in kind of like, you know, what it is to really make art. But at the same time, I think that there are questions that kind of like are embedded in my practice that do kind of reach back to kind of things that are kind of like historic questions, kind of like from kind of like 60s conceptual art, or kind of like even earlier, kind of like even kind of like, you know, what does it mean for something to be an image? I think kind of like these are not new questions. These are questions that people have been grappling with for, you know, now like, you know, hundreds of years, or not hundreds of years, but, you know, a long time. And I think it's just kind of like taking those questions and kind of pushing them forward, and kind of like in the latest technologies.
That's so true. Yeah, and I think it's really, I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, that um, kind of like what you were saying at the beginning, that this distinction between art and not art is not as interesting as just like asking more interesting questions.
And I
And I
think,
feel like,
and
oh,
I
I
think
feel like you're definitely doing that with your
And
work.
I think like one of the things that I hope will happen as this area kind of like matures a bit is that, because like at the moment, I think everyone's kind of lumped together as like machine learning art. But a lot of, if you look at kind of like the way that kind of like, say, I make work versus say someone like Rafiq, who Anadol makes work, who creates these really kind of spectacular, beautiful looking, kind of huge rendered kind of installations. We're trying to do very different things. We're asking very different questions. We have very different audiences, very different kind of like probably ways of viewing the world. And I think as kind of like this stops being, and I think this is already happening, because when I started working in this area, it like curators just wanted it because of the spectacle. They wanted it because it was like a machine made this. But now there's more literacy, and now people kind of understand more what's going on and why it's going on. It's easier, I think, for people to kind of understand what is interesting about a piece, or kind of like, and then kind of like pair it with kind of like other works. So I'm most excited now about being in shows which aren't about AI, and that I'm just like, it's about kind of like, you know, the environment or drawing or whatever. And I'm one of other artists, and it's kind of more grouped around concepts versus the material. But I think a lot when I started out, it was very much like, that it was being, shows were being curated around the concept of machine learning and AI. But I do think that is changing now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that it gives it a bit more longevity as things mature, and it's not just a novelty.
Yeah, it's not just a spectacle.
Okay, I got a couple of questions now, so I'll relay them. Gilberto Bernardes says, congratulations on your fascinating work. There are so many intricate levels contributing to each piece, from very traditional and to novel methodologies. Okay, and then he has three questions. So I will just give you all of them and then let you respond to the whole thing. What would be your advice to young artists willing to work on these materialities? Do you believe AI is a fundamental tool in fine art education? And what would be your take on new curricular directions for art practice?
So I would say for people who want to kind of get started out in this is, first of all, allow yourself 3 times more time than you think it's going to take for you to make, because it will never, ever, ever work the first time. I would also say there are lots of kind of like fantastic resources that are available, things like Runway ML, which kind of like allow you, if you don't have a kind of like coding background, to kind of like really quickly play with kind of these things. You're not able to kind of like unpick everything, but you can get a result quite quickly. And I would say kind of like play around with that, and then kind of like slowly build. So you're not trying to kind of like do everything all at once, but just try and kind of like put it into some pre-trained models, see what happens, and then try and train your own models. And also be prepared for failure, because I think whenever you're working with the very latest technology, and especially if you're trying to push it to do something that it wasn't designed to do, it will break, and you have to kind of be comfortable with expending a large amount of time, a large amount of resource for something that may never work. And I speak from experience, because I spent all of last year trying to get a particular model to work, and it just didn't. And I've just had to like make my peace with it and stop. But that's kind of like the price of being in this world, and it's what makes it exciting and interesting. But it's also, you know, you have to be comfortable with the fact that not everything you do will work. So don't be disappointed, I suppose, is my other piece of advice. And what was the second question?
The second one was, do you believe AI is a fundamental tool in fine art education?
I think it's not fundamental in so much as like it needs to be there. I think it can be a really interesting way of exploring the world. I think it opens up a lot of questions, as I said before, around kind of what it means to essentially to be human, what it means to kind of like try and create a world, to try and capture everything. For me, it's like a way, it can be a very powerful way of engaging with kind of how we have chosen to kind of construct society, by looking at kind of like how we categorize things, how we label things, what we choose to be important enough to record, versus what we leave behind, a way of kind of like thinking about how things are designed, how those designs are embedded in society. And so I think for a certain type of person, it can open up and unlock a lot of thinking, or either as kind of like a methodology, or as kind of like a process, or as like a material. And then the third question, which I think was, what ways do you think this should be part of kind of like art practice in the future? Is that correct? What was the third question?
Yeah, that was it.
I think, again, it's kind of very similar. I think it will suit certain people, certain kind of practices. I think it can be, and I think kind of thinking about it from kind of like multiple different ways, because there are ways of kind of using it as a tool of critique. It's a way of kind of like writing, thinking, as a material, and kind of like as a process. All different things kind of like will suit different people. So I think kind of being quite broad about how you consider what machine learning is can be helpful, because some really powerful work doesn't actually use machine learning at all. It just uses the kind of results of it, and kind of interrogates that, or interrogates the data set. And so there are lots of different ways of approaching it. And I think that's, again, what makes it this really rich area, is that there are so many different routes that you can kind of go into it from, and kind of get really interesting results and ideas.
That's really interesting. Okay, I have another question from Carlos Suarez. And he says, if I understand correctly, you argue that art is not just about the result. So will we need an artificial body and an artificial personal history to be able to have an artificial artist?
I think for me, art is a very human thing. So I think for me, what I'm kind of trying to say is that it's very much about the experience as well, the kind of way that you kind of engage with something. So that's kind of like what I didn't really talk about, was kind of like how I think about how the work is then presented in a gallery or online or wherever. And that relationship between kind of like the viewer and the artwork, and that kind of where, because that is essentially where meaning is created. It's that kind of the experience of the person looking at the thing. And I kind of like, and I don't know if my work is successful in all cases. And I think with the tulip stuff, there's definitely, it needs a lot of explanation to get all of these layers. But I always think you need to kind of give people, like, people need to kind of do a little bit of work when they're in that space, in the gallery space. They need to kind of like create the answer themselves. If you feed everyone the entire thing, if someone doesn't have to do that mental work to kind of figure something out, I think it just slides off you. It kind of becomes too slick, and you don't kind of get that hook that engages people and that people remember by. So for me, that kind of like that moment of the viewer and the artwork, or the viewer and the kind of reading of something and then looking at something, that's the magical thing. And that's kind of where I think a lot of artists spend time thinking about kind of like how their work is kind of like displayed, how it's kind of received, how it's kind of like how that kind of moment of engagement happens. And I think, and that's kind of also where kind of like someone kind of like looks at something and decides that this is an artwork, or looks at something, decides this is a squiggle that doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. And I think kind of like for an artificial artist to kind of exist, they need to be able to do that calculation, that kind of that leap into the mind of someone else, the empathy, the understanding, the kind of like the consideration of what someone else might think of it. And I think we're just such a long way from that at the moment, to be able to kind of like truly comprehend. And I think kind of like, if you are talking about AGI, artificial and general intelligence, I think empathy and kind of like the ability to kind of imagine as someone else, truly imagine as someone else, is for me like one of the big tests as to whether something really does have intelligence.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I feel like you touch on this really delicate balance that we have of the construction of meaning and how technology and art play into that very, yeah, just like delicate and fleeting crossing there.
Yeah, I think because my first degree that I studied was English literature, and there's so much kind of discussion about the author and the reader. And I think, and especially kind of like now when you have kind of systems like GPT-3, which kind of churn out like very novel like prose, but it's the reader that gives it meaning. It's the reader who kind of decides that this is poetry, that this is kind of like and he brings all of the associations, and he brings kind of like the histories and the context and the intertext into it. And so for me, kind of like when we talk about kind of like whether kind of like machines can create art, it's always kind of like there's always the kind of like this extra kind of thing that isn't really talked about, which is the viewer. And because like there's also the questions, can machines ever receive art? Can you ever kind of like teach art to a machine? Which I don't know. I don't, it's an open question.
That's really nice. Okay, I have another question that says, when you showed an impossible picture with flowers of different seasons, I wonder if it can do it easily with other contents. For example, mixing different facial expressions in a group of people included in the same situation. That would be helpful to psychological work upon people with problems in adapting themselves to specific emotional situations. Well, I guess it's not as much a question as a.
Yeah, no, I think you can do it with machine learning. You can kind of like make, if you can imagine it, you can make it. It's there's just so many options that you have once you have it. But again, kind of like as the question kind of or comment kind of gestured at, it's always then what do you do with it once you've done it? Like how is it useful? Because when you have like infinite possibilities, what do you decide to kind of make, render, and use?
Yeah, super interesting. I think I can take one more of the questions that I have written down. Um, Sorry. Okay. Often it seems as though machine learning is most interesting, as you mentioned, in the ways that it fails rather than the ways that it succeeds. So how do you think this might change as it becomes more powerful, at least on the surface? For example, that errors may still exist, but they may be harder to identify or to locate. Um,
I that's what I worry about in a way, because I think it's how to find the errors, because and what I find is by using the kind of like the very latest stuff before it kind of becomes more kind of like embedded, you can start to see these errors, because I do think it's so much harder once something becomes like cleaned up and shiny. So like an example, I was using the Google speech to text API before it kind of like has become embedded, and it's now called something else, I think. And previously you could kind of see it kind of like trying to work things out, and now it's just like only gives you the correct answer. And so I think a way to kind of get around kind of like everything becoming the errors becoming too hidden or too difficult to find, because too kind of like embedded inside these systems that you can't unpick, is by using the very latest things, or to kind of like engage with it at a very early stage, because then it is easier to see where things break. And I think also when you have that knowledge of knowing where things break, even when they do become more cleaned up and more kind of like polished and shiny, you kind of know where the soft spots are and you know where to go to look for them.
That's super interesting. Yeah, and I feel like your work really shows an intimacy of like getting really into the nitty gritty and like taking out everything under the car hood and playing with it.
Yeah, it's fun. I think it's kind of like the more that you kind of like know the systems that you're working with, the more you can kind of like, you can kind of find interesting things, because the longer that I've worked with these different types of technologies, the more able I am to kind of like find the interesting things. The kind of the analogy that I kind of give sometimes is like, it's like if you go to a bakery and say I want a chocolate cake, you're always going to get a chocolate cake. Whereas if you make your own chocolate cake, it might turn out to be a disaster, but you can choose to make cupcakes or put like salted caramel in it or like white chocolate or whatever, and you can start to like mess about and play with it, and you kind of like understand why it gets burnt because you put the temperature up too high, or why it won't cook because you put the temperature too low. And you can start to kind of like then use that knowledge across different cakes that you might want to make or whatever, to extend the analogy. But just like the more that you kind of like get your hands dirty, the more that you play with it and pull it apart, that knowledge kind of like carries across to so many different things.
That's really great. Well, I think that is kind of the end of the questions that have been sent in, and I feel like that gives us a good ending point of getting to hear your own thoughts about your practice. So I guess thank you so much, Anna. It's wonderful getting to discuss with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for listening and the wonderful questions.
And
Well, okay. I will also like to thank you very much, Anna Ridler, for your inspiring talk. And also thank you to you, Rosemary Lee, for your helping moderation on this event. Thank you all for your participation in this third Creativity Talks. And we are looking forward to see you soon already in our 40th talk on October 21 with Arthur Miller, Emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at University College of London, about the world of AI-powered creativity. An excellent night to you all. Please stay safe and be creative. Bye-bye.
Yeah.